The Guadalcanal Campaign, also known as the Battle of Guadalcanal and code-named Operation Watchtower, originally applying only to an operation to take the island of Tulagi by Allied forces, was a military campaign fought between the 7th of August 1942 and the 9th of February 1943 on and around the island of Guadalcanal in the Pacific theater of World War II. It was the first major offensive by Allied forces against the Empire of Japan. On the 7th of August 1942, Allied forces, predominantly United States Marines, landed on the islands of Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida in the southern Solomon Islands, with the objective of denying their use by the Japanese to threaten the supply and communication routes between the US, Australia, and New Zealand. The Allies also intended to use Guadalcanal and Tulagi as bases to support a campaign to eventually capture or neutralize the major Japanese base at Rabaul on New Britain. The Allies overwhelmed the outnumbered Japanese defenders, who had occupied the islands since May 1942, and captured Tulagi and Florida, as well as an airfield that was under construction on Guadalcanal. Powerful U.S. naval forces supported the landings. Surprised by the Allied offensive, the Japanese made several attempts between August and November to retake Henderson Field. 3 major land battles, 7 large naval battles, and continual, almost daily aerial battles culminated in the decisive naval Battle of Guadalcanal in early November, in which the last Japanese attempt to bombard Henderson Field from the sea and land with enough troops to retake it was defeated. In December, the Japanese abandoned their efforts to retake Guadalcanal and evacuated their remaining forces by the 7th of February 1943 in the face of an offensive by the U.S. Army's 14th Corps. The Guadalcanal Campaign was a significant strategic combined arms victory by Allied forces over the Japanese in the Pacific theater. The Japanese had reached the peak of their conquests in the Pacific. The victories at Milne Bay, Bunagona, and Guadalcanal marked the Allied transition from defensive operations to the strategic initiative in that theater, leading to offensive operations such as the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and Central Pacific campaigns, that resulted in Japan's eventual surrender and the end of World War II. Background: strategic considerations. On the 7th of December 1941, Japanese forces attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack crippled much of the U.S. battleship fleet and precipitated an open and formal state of war between the two nations. The initial goals of Japanese leaders were to neutralize the U.S. Navy, seize possessions rich in natural resources, and establish strategic military bases to defend Japan's empire in the Pacific Ocean and Asia. To further those goals, Japanese forces captured the Philippines, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, Gilbert Islands, New Britain and Guam. Joining the U.S. in the war against Japan were the rest of the Allied powers, several of whom, including the United Kingdom, Australia and the Netherlands, had also been attacked by Japan. 2 attempts by the Japanese to continue their strategic initiative and offensively extend their outer defensive perimeter in the South and Central Pacific to where they could threaten Australia and Hawaii or the U.S. West Coast were thwarted at the naval battles of Coral Sea and Midway, respectively. Coral Sea was a tactical stalemate, but a strategic Allied victory which became clear only much later. Midway was not only the Allies' first clear major victory against the Japanese, it significantly reduced the offensive capability of Japan's carrier forces, but did not change their offensive mindset for several crucial months in which they compounded mistakes by moving ahead with brash, even brazen decisions, such as the attempt to assault Port Moresby over the Kokoda Trail. Up to this point, the Allies had been on the defensive in the Pacific, but these strategic victories provided them an opportunity to seize the initiative from Japan. The Allies chose the Solomon Islands, specifically the southern Solomon Islands of Guadalcanal, Tulagi and Florida Island, as the first target. designated Task 1, codenamed Pestilence, with 3 specific objectives. Originally the objectives were the occupation of the Santa Cruz Islands, codenamed Huddle, Tulagi, codenamed Watchtower, and adjacent positions. Guadalcanal, eventually the focus of the operation, was not even mentioned in the early directive and eventually took on the operation name Watchtower. The Imperial Japanese Navy had occupied Tulagi in May 1942 and had constructed a seaplane base nearby. Allied concern grew large when, in early July 1942, the IJN began constructing a large airfield at Lunga Point on nearby Guadalcanal. From such a base, Japanese long-range bombers would threaten the sea lines of communication from the west coast of the Americas to the populous east coast of Australia. By August 1942, the Japanese had about 900 naval troops on Tulagi and nearby islands and 2,800 personnel on Guadalcanal. These bases would protect Japan's major base at Rabaul, threaten Allied supply and communication lines and establish a staging area for a planned offensive against Fiji, New Caledonia and Samoa. The Japanese planned to deploy 45 fighters and 60 bombers to Guadalcanal. In the overall strategy for 1942, these aircraft could provide air cover for Japanese naval forces advancing farther into the South Pacific. The Allied plan to invade the Southern Solomons was conceived by U.S. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet. He proposed the offensive to deny the use of the islands by the Japanese as bases to threaten the supply routes between the United States and Australia and to use them as starting points. With U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's tacit consent, King also advocated the invasion of Guadalcanal. Because the United States supported Great Britain's proposal that priority be given to defeating Germany before Japan, the Pacific Theater had to compete for personnel and resources with the European Theater. An early obstacle was desire by both the Army and Roosevelt to initiate action in Europe. In addition, there was an issue of command in which Tulagi lay in the area under command of General Douglas MacArthur while the Santa Cruz Islands lay in Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's Pacific Ocean area, which would also supply almost all offensive forces that would prepare and be supplied and covered from that area. Both were overcome and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, General George C. Marshall gave the operation full support, even if MacArthur's command could not lend support, and the Navy had to take full responsibility. As a result, and in order to preserve unity of command, the boundary between MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area and Nimitz's Pacific Ocean area was shifted 60 miles to 360 miles to the west effective 1 August 1942. The CJCS ordered for 1,942.43 Pacific objectives that Guadalcanal would be carried out in conjunction with an Allied offensive in New Guinea under Douglas MacArthur, to capture the Admiralty Islands and the Bismarck Archipelago, including the major Japanese base at Rabaul. The directive held that the eventual goal was the American reconquest of the Philippines. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff created the South Pacific Theater, with Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley taking command on 19 June 1942, to direct the offensive in the Solomons. Admiral Chester Nimitz, based at Pearl Harbor, was designated as overall Allied Commander-in-Chief for Pacific Forces. Task Force in preparation for the offensive in the Pacific in May 1942, U.S. Marine Major General Alexander Vandergrift was ordered to move his 1st Marine Division from the United States to New Zealand. Other Allied land, naval and air force units were sent to establish or reinforce bases in Fiji, Samoa, New Hebrides and New Caledonia. Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides, was selected as the headquarters and main base for the offensive, codenamed Operation Watchtower, with the commencement date set for 7 August 1942. At first, the Allied offensive was planned just for Tulagi and the Santa Cruz Islands, omitting Guadalcanal. After Allied reconnaissance discovered the Japanese airfield construction efforts on Guadalcanal, its capture was added to the plan and the Santa Cruz operation was dropped. The Japanese were aware, via signals intelligence, of the large-scale movement of Allied forces in the South Pacific area, but concluded that the Allies were reinforcing Australia and perhaps Port Moresby in New Guinea. The Watchtower force, numbering 75 warships and transports, assembled near Fiji on 26 July 1942 and engaged in one rehearsal landing prior to leaving for Guadalcanal on 31 July. The commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force was U.S. Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher. Commanding the amphibious forces was U.S. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner. Vandergrift led the 16,000 Allied infantry earmarked for the landings. The troops sent to Guadalcanal were fresh from military training and armed with bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifles and a meager 10-day supply of ammunition. Because of the need to get them into battle quickly, the operation planners had reduced their supplies from 90 days to only 60 days. The men of the 1st Marine Division began referring to the coming battle as Operation Shoestring.